And this is our third section in our unit on Islam, and hopefully the audio in this section holds up better than the one in the first one. I apologize for that. I don't know why exactly the first one I recorded, the audio cut out halfway through, but hopefully this one will be okay. So in this section, we're going to talk about the resurgence of political and economic power in the Muslim world, how that's been affecting Muslim society. We're going to talk about the issues of traditions versus modernity. And again, this is something I think we've talked about in most of our different religious units, right? This is something that all religions are facing right now, the issue of how to deal with modernism and how to deal with change. We're going to talk about Islam's relationship with the West, current times, its the challenges it's facing here. We're going to talk a little bit about how that fits into the political situation in America and in people's minds. And then we're going to talk about Muslim outreach and education. So in the last century or so, a lot of Muslim countries, especially ones in the Middle East, have gone from being relatively poor, relatively without a lot of international clout or international power, to becoming very, very important world powers. And that is because of oil. That is because of the oil that's been found in the Middle East. And that's had a large impact on a lot of Muslim societies, clearly. So you can see down here, this picture. This is a picture taken in Dubai. Here's a Muslim woman with her boyfriend or her husband. And on top, she's wearing a hijab. She has her head covered, and she's wearing, loose clothing, but she's also in this very modern mall shopping for shoes. Her boyfriend is in traditional Arab gear, but he's also, mostly clean-shaven and carrying a cell phone, right? So, like we've seen in India and Buddhist countries, a lot of other places, you see a lot of Western influence kind of interacting with the traditional cultures. A lot, because of all the change societies have been undergoing and the influence of Western countries, a lot of Muslims have been turning to Islam and the Sharia law as a blueprint for modern political rule, right? And they're facing the same problems that Buddhism and Hinduism and Christianity and Judaism are facing, that a lot of the younger people are modernizing, they're westernizing, they're interested in consumerism, and there's a question about, and there's also been a lot of political unrest in the Middle East, and a lot of Muslims are turning to their traditions to help form a more just and more virtuous society. And we'll see there are different examples of the way countries do this. So the big difference that a lot of Westerners, a lot of other people don't understand about Islamic countries is that many places like America, Europe, Canada, even in Asia, religion is a private matter. It's something that you choose to do yourself. But for many Muslims, in Muslim countries, religion is kind of a public matter. It's something that can and maybe even should affect public life and government laws and rules and things like that. It's something that should imbue all parts of life because it's meant to create a more just society, right? A lot of Western religions, we've seen this in Judaism, we've seen this in aspects of Christianity, and now in Islam as well, see part of their role as providing rules and providing a framework for making a more just world. We even see that to some extent in the East, though, as many people pointed out, in Asia, when Asian religions do this, it's not always as clear-cut. It's not so much, with the 10 Commandments, and here's a set of rules for us to follow, and here are a set of laws. Rather, there's more of just an encouragement of right living, of dharma, of living in harmony, and things like that. Maybe the only example we could it's comparable is maybe Confucianism, right? Which is interested in creating correct relationships with one another, and through correct relationships, a just society. So that is what the issue of Islamic law, the Sharia, that's what it has to do with, a lot of the protests and a lot of the unrest you see in a lot of Muslim nations about to what extent it should be involved in the government. It's about whether or not it will help create a more just society. Different Muslims have very different opinions. We shouldn't assume that this is a situation where all Muslims feel the same way on the matter. There are Muslims on far ends, either end of the spectrum. People who think that it should view all parts of life, private, public, and people who think that the government should kind of stay out of religion and not be impacted by it. So as I said, right, there's no political unit of global Islam. It's a good way of putting it. Really no single understanding of what a modern Islamic state should look like. Some countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia depend heavily on the Sharia for their mode of governance. And in other places, like Turkey is a great example of a modern state that is that's quite secular, right? Turkey, the majority of people are Muslim, but there are also a good deal of Christians, and they live together pretty harmoniously for the most part. And for just in general, Turkey tends to be a more westernized country, and the people tend to be less interested in having Sharia be involved in the government, right? Most Turkish Muslims, ones that I have met, have seen that to be something that is more something that families should decide for themselves, to what extent that should impact them. And then there are great extremes like the Taliban in Afghanistan, which try to enforce a very certain rigid interpretation of the Quran and the Sharia and the Sunnah for each and every member of Afghani society. Right? That was a really extreme situation. And then there are other places where I'm trying to think of a good example. Turkey is the best example I can think of a more secular society. There's everything in between. And then in recent years, we had the Arab Spring in Egypt and Tunisia and several other Arab countries, countries that began protesting corruption in the government and overthrowing corrupt leaders. And from that has come a whole new conversation about how these countries, especially Egypt, should restructure their government. To what extent should religion play a role in that? Down here we have two sets of protesters. Here's a set of women with signs that say Islam is the solution for Egypt and democracy will bring oppression. And then on the other hand, you have people who are saying pluralism, which is, multiple religions, and secularism is the true solution, and secular democracy protects religious freedom. So there are people on both sides. You also might hear in the news about the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is an organization that's 100 or 200 years old. I'm not an expert on it. I've heard it mentioned in a lot of different sources. It is a interpretation. The Muslim Brotherhood is a group of people with a very specific interpretation of the Quran and the Sharia. They tend to be more conservative, more traditional, not necessarily extremist. Though some people have tried to link them to Muslim extremists. There aren't any real clear links that I know of. And I could be wrong on that. But the Muslim Brotherhood, I know they played a role in the reestablishment of autonomous governments in Middle Eastern countries after the British Empire left the Middle East after World War II. The Muslim Brotherhood took a great interest in the way the governments of Saudi Arabia and other places were reformed, with great attention to how much Sharia was used in the formation of the new legal codes. And I know they are big proponents of Sharia and of kind of traditional interpretations of it. Currently, hear a lot about how active the Muslim Brotherhood is in Egypt. trying to encourage the Egyptian government, as it's restructuring itself, to lean more towards a more conservative, a more religious government. And I know that they also had a part to play in the early 20th century. Actually, part of what founded them was a belief that the Sufis, the Sufi mystics of Islam, had become too kind of unconventional, unorthodox, that they were moving the people away from traditional, simple, pure Islam. And they, had a lot to play with the kind of the oppression of Sufis that took place in the early 20th century. So that they're a major player right now in this, right? But there's also this huge kind of progressive secular group of Muslims that don't necessarily fall under a name the way the Muslim Brotherhood does, but they're interested, especially in women's issues are huge in these Muslim countries right now. To what extent should women be allowed to do anything? From in Saudi Arabia, women are fighting for the right to drive cars, which they're not allowed to do. In other places, they're fighting for the right to run for office and be political leaders and things like that. So women's issues are really big in the secular progressive sides of Islam right now. And there are also a lot of questions about, as I say, to what extent should people of any country be allowed to elect their leaders. And the United Arab Emirates, which is one of the richest countries in the world, it's where Dubai is. If you don't know what Dubai is, it's probably one of the richest cities in the world. Up until just a couple of years ago, the country was for the most part a monarchy. It was run by a royal family. And just a couple of years ago, they held their first democratic election, and women were allowed to vote. And they didn't choose a new leader over the king, but they did choose they were allowed to vote for parliamentary members. So a lot of countries are struggling with these issues right now, right? To what extent should any country be democratic? And how does democracy fit in with Sharia? In the West, the West is obviously kind of the source of a lot of these questions. Some Muslims are looking to the West as an example of how democracy can work. But a lot of Westerners still misunderstand Muslims and what they stand for and what they're about. In the United States, especially, Islam is the fastest growing religion, and yet I think it's the least understood. It might be the second largest religion in the country. Most of the Muslims, American Muslims, are immigrants and their descendants. Recently, there's been a great influx, especially of Muslim immigrants from Somalia, from what other places? Not as many from Syria. Syrian refugees are ending up more in Europe, but a lot of African countries. A lot of Muslims are coming in from those countries, and so it's starting to become a more common thing to see Muslims on the street, see Muslims around, and a third of the converts in America are a third of the converts a third of the American Muslims are converts. Let me put it that way. A third of American Muslims are converts, people who've converted. And I'm actually working to try and get a friend of a friend who converted to Islam to talk about his experience. He married an Egyptian woman who is Muslim herself, and they live here in Illinois now, and he converted to Islam for her, but it was also kind of a personal thing as well. So I'm trying to get him to talk about his experience. There are a lot of people converting to Islam now. It's very attractive to a lot of people. It's an interesting tradition. It's a beautiful tradition. A lot of people talk about, people who've converted talk about kind of the purity of it and the simplicity of it and how it kind of fits into their daily life in terms of daily prayer and things like that. It's a picture of some American Muslim women, women of all colors and creeds. One of the most famous American convert to Islam, Malcolm X, who played a great role in the conversion of a good deal of African Americans to Islam. And also there's a picture of a Muslim woman and her family going out for a parade in New York. So the American Muslim community really varies widely in terms of diversity, in terms of ethnic background, geographic background. And maybe that's part of the reason why a lot of Americans don't well understand what Islam is about, because there's really no one, there's not a really good set, I guess, group that represent what Islam is about. You see all sorts of different people. You see women in veils, you see women without veils, you see men who dress traditionally and men who don't. And in terms of opinions and the way they practice their own religions, they can vary widely as well. And unfortunately, because of issues of extremism, because the Muslim extremists have been so vocal and so visible in the last 20 years or so, a lot of Westerners associate Islam with extremism, especially in light of the 9/11 attacks, in light of different extremist groups like Al-Qaeda, Hamas, which is a Palestinian suicide or a Palestinian extremist group that's devoted not only to to Sharia but also to exterminating Israel. There's been a growing anti-Muslim sentiment in America. You see it a lot, and usually it's built out of ignorance and a lack of understanding what Islam's about. I pulled this picture from the internet, and this is a really good example. Some of you might remember that several years ago, a Muslim community bought an empty building, a public building in New York, a couple blocks from the World Trade Center, the site of the old World Trade Centers, and they intended to turn into a community center. One of the levels of this community center was going to include a space for a mosque. The rest of the floors, the levels, were going to have like several other community things, like a community-owned gym, like kind of like a YMCA. And it was going to be open to the entire community, Muslim and non-Muslim alike. But this one floor within the building was going to be used as a mosque and a place to worship. And the local people, it wasn't the local people, it was kind of the news media that kind of blew it out of proportion. I remember reading about this at the time, and a lot of the people who lived in the community, non-Muslims who lived in the community, were fine with this building going up and with this building being owned by a Muslim community. They thought it was just an abandoned building. It was just a draw for vagrants and the homeless and for drug deals and things like that. They were glad that something was going to go in its place. But it got all this attention by the news, and a lot of people thought it was offensive that they were going to put in a mosque right by the site of the World Trade Center bombings, which were, committed by Muslim extremists, and they thought it was a great insult to the American people. And there were all of these, I don't know if you remember, there were all of these awful, really ignorant-based protests against this building. Against this community center, and this has been a big problem. Most Muslims will tell you that what it's like to live in America is to constantly have to kind of defend themselves. You remember that Michael Litchens, my friend who talked about Catholicism, said that the one thing he doesn't like about being Catholic is he feels like he has to constantly defend the Catholic Church. And he gets tired of it. He gets tired of his religion being something that he has to explain to people. And for Muslims, it's even more so, I would say. Muslims get a really bad rap in the news media, and we're going to do, this week, we're going to actually have a little assignment on that. But most Muslims will say that, whenever they talk to new people, people will bring up 9/11. People will be like, well, how do you feel about 9/11? And they'll say, well, of course, I'm against it. Of course I'm against killing people. Of course I don't consider these people to be, true followers of Islam. These are extremists. These are, crazy people who've had their mind filled with all sorts of false ideas. But a lot of Muslims also feel it's kind of their responsibility to be good representatives of Islam. And that can be stressful as well. But there have been a lot of outreach and educational programs in recent years as well that have been meant to inform the public about Islam and what it's about. Next week, we're going to start talking about religion in the 21st century, and we're going to talk a lot about interfaith groups in America, organizations that try to bring people of different religions together to educate the public about what different religions are like and how we can kind of live together in peace. And every interfaith program, right, every interfaith group that I've ever been a part of or ever seen has always had a very strong Muslim population, or Muslims who are really interested in spreading the word about Islam and explaining to people what it's about. This is a major difficulty that Muslims are having in the West right now. There's this bad reputation. There are a lot of Muslim outreach groups right now interested in educating people. They've been really good at using forms of mass communication like satellite television. I know there's one organization called Why Islam that uses billboards that encourages people to call like a hotline and ask questions, ask any question you want about Islam. Also there has been one particular really interesting ad campaign called My Jihad, which I mentioned here, right? We talked about this last week, how jihad is something that's greatly misunderstood, and there have been several organizations that have tried to explain what jihad is. And then there's just a lot of scholars, right? A lot of Islamic scholars who, try to reach out to news organizations and educate them and teach journalists about what Islam is, because a lot of what we get about Islam is from the news media, and that means it's coming through journalists. And a lot of journalists who don't know very much about religion, who don't know very much about science or politics, but still are expected to write articles on it. So a lot of Muslim scholars have been reaching out to news organizations and to universities and other groups that help, proliferate important information. One example of this is the My Jihad bus campaign. We talked a little bit about this last week, but we know that the term jihad literally means struggle. The way Muslims use it is based upon this from the Hadith right here, this one tiny little story from the Hadith that one of the Prophet Muhammad's friends tell, that they had been out with Prophet Muhammad. They had been battling their enemies from Mecca, who were trying to eradicate the early Muslim group. And they came back one day victorious from battle, and it says, the Prophet returned and he told us, you have arrived with an excellent arrival. You have come from the lesser jihad to the greater jihad, the striving of a servant against his desires. So the way the Prophet used this term was that the struggle against their enemies on the battlefield was lesser in comparison to that of them trying to strive against or struggle against their desires. So the struggle to basically be a good person. And that's how most Muslims understand jihad, right? We talked about that. In particular, I found this in one of the textbooks. The Sunnis have 4 different interpretations of the concept of jihad. There's the jihad of the heart, which is combating the devil and the attempt to escape his persuasion to evil. this type of jihad was regarded as the greater or the greatest jihad, right? Striving against your desire to do evil. Jihad by the tongue, speaking the truth and spreading the word of Islam with one's tongue. Jihad by the hand, doing what is right to combat injustice and what is wrong with action. Now, a lot of Muslims, especially Muslim men, consider this an important part of what they consider to be like manhood, or what it is to be a Muslim man, to fight against injustice where they see it, to stand up for the weak, stand up for the bullied. I've heard that a lot. And then jihad by the sword is what is called the lesser jihad. It's armed fighting in the way of God or holy war. And most Muslims understand this as to be something that's to be used for self-defense, right? Fighting Islam's enemies when they want to, eradicate the religion. But groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, which we mentioned, the Salafi Muslims, tend to take that and really, I guess, kind of pervert its meaning into being destroying any sort of even cultural influence that is, I guess, not that doesn't promote Sharia or doesn't promote their particular interpretation of Sharia, right? Any sort of negative cultural impact from any country, any people, any place against their idea of what a Muslim society should be. Fighting that to them is jihad of the sword. But most Muslims would disagree, right? And it's interesting, a lot of Muslims, I've heard this from older Muslims, a lot of Muslims didn't even use the term jihad very much until after 9/11, when terrorism and extremism came to be part of the modern world, and these terrorists and extremists were throwing around the word jihad a lot in this very particular sense. But a lot of just your average Muslims don't talk about jihad on a daily basis, even the greater jihad, right? It's not like it's a term that wasn't used very often. It was something they might have known about or heard of, but it wasn't thrown around a lot until these terrorists started pulling it out and using it, and the rest of the Muslims, majority of Muslims, felt a need to try and explain what it really meant and how the extremists pervert its meaning. So it's kind of interesting. So now it's kind of become part of the national conversation. So Muslims have tried to, make themselves a part of that conversation and correct people and educate people on what it means. For the assignment, for the discussion, you're going to go to the lessons page, and there's going to be a link for the Jihad bus ads. It's an article on the Huffington Post, and it has pictures of this ad campaign. It's very interesting. I think you're really going to enjoy it. So take a look at that, and that will inform your discussion posts. So for the future, I mean, there's still this huge, Islam is in the middle of this huge global conversation, this global debate about what the future of Islam is, and it includes religious modernists, which are, members of the religion who want to incorporate Sharia into the government, but in a kind of a modern new way, Islamicists who are more traditional, and then secularists who don't want to see religion in government at all. And they're all trying to fight extremism in their own ways. They're all trying to find ways of relating to the changing world, to becoming a part of the larger world, because certainly in places like Saudi Arabia and other places that are oil rich, they're an integral part of the world economy and world politics. So socially then, how do they fit in? It's the big question. Western media focuses a lot on sensationalism in Islam. It's kind of sad. Like I say, we're going to have an assignment this week looking at that. But there are many currents forward of progressive perspectives on in the Muslim world. People who want democracy, who are and I shouldn't say, I don't want to make it seem like democracy is the ideal government system for everyone, because certainly it's not the case. But there are people who are looking for more peaceful ways of living with the world. I love this protest right here. It's in an Arab country, I'm not sure which one, I want to say it was maybe Syria, or maybe Iraq, where there's been a lot of Shiite Sunni violence. But she writes, I am Muslim, right? She crosses out these two words. She's not Shia Muslim, she's not Sunni Muslim, she's Muslim. And for the most part, I think I want to say that that's kind of the attitude of most Muslims. Most Muslims that I've ever met have only been interested in living in peaceful coexistence with the rest of the world. But there are questions about how to fit in their traditions and their beliefs into the modern world, right? That's a question all the religions we're looking at have right now. So with that, go ahead and take a look at the lessons page, the Jihad bus ads. Answer the question, why do you think the Muslim community in the West wanted to target the concept of jihad? Why not, talking about issues of women's rights, or, I don't know, education, or the 5 pillars of Islam, or anything else? Why jihad? And do you think this ad campaign is a good idea? Do you think it's going to help them reach their goals? Okay. Email me with any questions. I hope the audio on this file works.